Imagine walking into a marketplace 500 years ago. You see merchants haggling over silk, spices, and precious metals. But hidden among these transactions is something that would shock us today: the sale of children. Not as slaves, but as brides and grooms. Their value measured not in love or compatibility, but in land, livestock, and political power. This isn't a story about ancient barbarity that we've left behind. This is a story about one of humanity's most persistent economic systems, one that shaped civilizations, built empires, and continues to affect millions of lives today. Child marriage wasn't just a cultural practice. It was big business. What if everything you thought you knew about marriage was wrong? What if the romantic love stories we cherish today were actually revolutionary acts that challenged thousands of years of economic tradition? What if the institution we consider sacred was once nothing more than a contract between families, signed in the blood of childhood innocence? Today, we're going to uncover the hidden history of child marriage as a business transaction. We'll travel through time and across continents to understand how children became commodities, families became corporations, and love became the most radical idea of all. The year is 1469. In the courts of Europe, two children are about to change the course of history. Isabella of Castile is 18, practically an old maid by the standards of her time. Ferdinand of Aragon is 17. Their marriage isn't about romance. It's about creating the most powerful empire the world has ever seen. The dowry negotiations took months. The political implications would last centuries. But Isabella and Ferdinand were lucky. They were at least teenagers when they wed. For most of history, children as young as 7 or 8 found themselves bound in marriage contracts they couldn't read, for reasons they couldn't understand, to secure deals they would never benefit from. How did we get here? How did humanity create a system where childhood ended not with maturity, but with a signature on a marriage contract? The answer lies in understanding that for most of human history, children weren't seen as individuals with rights and dreams. They were seen as assets, valuable assets that could be leveraged, traded, and invested for maximum return. Let's start our journey in ancient Rome, where the foundations of marriage as business were first carved in stone. In the Roman Empire, the year 150 AD, a wealthy merchant named Marcus Aurelius Mercator is planning his daughter's future. She's only 12, but already he's receiving offers. Not from suitors, mind you, but from their fathers. Each offer comes with a detailed financial proposal: land holdings, trade routes, political connections, and cold, hard sestertii. The Romans had a term for this: matrimonium, which literally meant the legal condition of being a mother. Notice, it didn't mean the condition of being in love or the condition of being happy. It meant the legal transfer of a woman from her father's household to her husband's, along with all the economic benefits that transfer entailed. Roman law was crystal clear about the business nature of marriage. The dose, or dowry, was a legally binding contract. The bride's family paid the groom's family for the privilege of joining their economic unit. The amount was negotiated like any other business deal, with lawyers, contracts, and penalty clauses for breach of agreement. But here's what's truly shocking. The Romans weren't unusual. They were just more honest about it than most cultures. While we might look back at Roman marriage practices with horror, they were actually progressive in one key way. Roman girls couldn't legally marry until they were 12. In many other ancient cultures, the age was even lower. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Code of Hammurabi from 1754 BC included detailed regulations about marriage contracts. These weren't love songs carved in stone. They were business regulations. If a man wanted to marry, he had to negotiate a bride price with the girl's father. If the father changed his mind after accepting payment, he had to pay double the bride price back as a penalty. If the daughter refused the marriage, she could be sold into slavery. Think about that for a moment. A child's refusal to accept a business arrangement could result in her being sold as property. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was economics. Children who disrupted family business plans were economic liabilities that had to be dealt with. But why children? Why not wait until people were adults to arrange these economic marriages? The answer reveals the cold logic behind the system. First, younger brides meant longer reproductive years. In a world without modern medicine, where childbirth was dangerous and infant mortality was high, families needed as many children as possible. Starting early maximized the potential return on investment. Second, younger partners were easier to control and shape. A 7-year-old bride could be molded to fit perfectly into her new family's economic and social structure. An 18-year-old might have her own ideas, her own preferences, her own dangerous notion of personal autonomy. Third, child marriage was a form of insurance. In uncertain times, securing a child's future through marriage protected them from poverty, war, and social upheaval. Or at least, that's how parents justified it to themselves. But perhaps most importantly, child marriage was about consolidating wealth and power. When two families joined through marriage, they weren't just combining households, they were merging business empires. Let's travel forward in time to medieval Europe, where the business of child marriage reached new heights of sophistication. The year is 1152. Eleanor of Aquitaine is having her marriage to Louis VII of France annulled. She's 30, which makes her practically ancient by medieval standards. But Eleanor is no ordinary woman. She's the Duchess of Aquitaine, controller of vast territories that make up nearly a third of modern France. Her divorce isn't just a personal matter. It's a massive economic restructuring. Within 2 months of her annulment, Eleanor marries Henry Plantagenet, who would become Henry II of England. This wasn't a whirlwind romance. This was a hostile corporate takeover. By marrying Eleanor, Henry didn't just gain a wife. He gained control of territories that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Eleanor's story illustrates how medieval marriage was the ultimate merger and acquisition tool. Noble families were essentially corporations, and marriage was how they expanded their holdings, eliminated competition, and secured their market position. The medieval period saw the development of increasingly sophisticated systems for managing these marriage transactions. The Catholic Church, despite preaching about the sanctity of marriage, became the world's largest marriage broker. Church records from the period read like business ledgers, meticulously tracking dowries, bride prices, and the complex negotiations that preceded every noble wedding. But it wasn't just the nobility. Even among peasants, marriage was primarily an economic arrangement. A farmer didn't choose a wife based on love. He chose based on how many acres her family controlled, how many cows she would bring to the marriage, and whether her family had useful trade connections. Children in medieval Europe were often betrothed before they could walk. These arrangements were so important that breaking them could trigger wars. The marriage contract between 7-year-old Margaret of Scotland and the infant Edward of England in 1290 was designed to unite the two kingdoms. When Margaret died before the marriage could be consummated, it triggered decades of warfare between England and Scotland. Think about the psychology of this system. Children grew up knowing they were commodities. Their value was determined not by their character, intelligence, or dreams, but by their family's wealth and political connections. They lived their entire lives knowing that their most important decision, who they would spend their life with, had already been made for them before they learned to speak. But medieval Europe was just one piece of a global puzzle. Across the world, other cultures were developing their own sophisticated systems for treating children as business assets. In ancient China, the practice of child marriage was elevated to an art form. The Chinese developed the concept of Tongyang Shi, or little daughter-in-law. Families would adopt very young girls, often as young as infancy, and raise them specifically to marry their sons. This system eliminated the need for dowry negotiations because the girl was already part of the household. It also ensured perfect compatibility because the girl was raised according to the family's exact specifications. The Chinese marriage system was so business-oriented that they developed a complex science of compatibility based not on personality, but on economic potential. The 8-character system analyzed the birth year, month, day, and hour of both potential partners to determine not whether they would be happy together, but whether their union would be financially prosperous. Chinese families kept detailed records of these calculations, passed down through generations like business plans. A family might spend decades planning the perfect economic marriage for a child, analyzing market conditions, political stability, and potential returns on investment. In Japan, the samurai class developed the miai system, a formal process for arranging marriages that was essentially a job interview process for brides. Families would exchange detailed dossiers outlining not just the potential bride's appearance and accomplishments, but her family's financial holdings, business connections, and political influence. These meetings weren't about getting to know each other. They were about finalizing business deals that had been negotiated for months or years in advance. The bride and groom were often meeting for the first time at their own wedding. But perhaps nowhere was the business nature of child marriage more explicitly acknowledged than in the Ottoman Empire. In the Ottoman court, marriage was state policy. The Sultan's marriages were diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers. His daughters were married off to secure trade agreements, military alliances, and territorial concessions. These weren't family celebrations. They were international business summits. The Ottoman system was so sophisticated that they maintained detailed bureaucratic records of every marriage negotiation. Ottoman archives contain thousands of documents outlining dowry agreements, political concessions, and economic benefits expected from each union. Children were literally line items in imperial budget reports. The Ottomans also pioneered the concept of marriage as investment diversification. Rather than arranging one major marriage alliance, they would arrange multiple smaller marriages, across different regions and social classes, spreading their risk like a modern investment portfolio. But the Ottoman Empire also reveals something crucial about the global nature of child marriage as business. This wasn't a practice that developed independently in different cultures. It was a distributed system that facilitated international trade and diplomacy. When an Ottoman princess married a Venetian merchant, she wasn't just joining two families. She was creating a business relationship between two empires. The dowry negotiations might include exclusive trading rights, reduced tariffs, and access to new markets. The marriage contract was also a trade agreement. This global network of marriage-based business relationships helped create the modern world economy. The Silk Road wasn't just about transporting goods, it was about transporting brides. Every major trade route was also a marriage route, connecting families across continents in a web of economic relationships. But as these systems became more sophisticated, they also became more brutal. The more valuable children became as economic assets, the less they were valued as human beings. Let's examine one of the most shocking examples of child marriage as business: the European practice of selling daughters to pay debts. In 16th century Europe, as capitalism began to emerge, families facing bankruptcy discovered they could literally sell their children to pay their creditors. The less they were valued as human beings, Let's examine one of the most shocking examples of child marriage as business. Stop, not into slavery, but into marriage. Desperate families would arrange marriages for their young daughters in exchange for immediate cash payments that would satisfy their debts. These transactions were recorded in official documents that read like inventory lists. A typical contract might specify: one daughter, age 11, good health, trained in household management, virgin, to be delivered upon payment of 500 florins, plus assumption of family debts totaling 200 florins. The girls had no say in these arrangements. They were property being transferred to settle financial obligations. Some families would arrange multiple marriages for the same daughter, collecting payments from several suitors and then disappearing, leaving the girl to sort out the competing claims. This practice became so common that several European cities passed laws requiring marriage contracts to be registered with local authorities to prevent fraud. These laws weren't designed to protect children. They were designed to protect the business interests of the men buying brides. But even more disturbing was the development of marriage speculation markets. Wealthy merchants began buying marriage contracts for young girls, not because they wanted wives, but because they wanted to profit from reselling the contracts at higher prices. A merchant might contract to marry a 7-year-old girl from a poor family for a relatively small payment. He would then wait several years and sell the contract to another man for a much higher price, keeping the profit. The girl would have no idea that she had been bought and sold multiple times before ever meeting her eventual husband. These speculative markets created a horrifying dynamic where the younger the girl, the more valuable she became. A 5-year-old represented more years of potential profit than a 15-year-old. Families were incentivized to sell their daughters as young as possible to maximize their return. The psychological damage of these systems is hard to imagine. Children grew up knowing they could be sold at any time. They lived in constant fear of being separated from their families, not because of war or disaster, but because of business decisions made in rooms they were never allowed to enter. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of child marriage as business was how it warped the concept of childhood itself. In societies where children were valuable economic assets, childhood wasn't seen as a time for play, education, and development. It was seen as a period of investment preparation. Girls were trained from toddlerhood in the skills that would make them valuable wives: cooking, cleaning, textile work, and absolute obedience. Boys were evaluated for their potential as husbands based on their family's wealth and their own economic prospects. A boy's education, career training, and even personality development were all oriented toward making him a valuable marriage partner. This created a society where children never experienced true childhood. They were miniature adults, constantly being evaluated and prepared for their eventual sale in the marriage market. The pressure on families to maximize their children's marriage value led to horrifying practices. Parents would restrict their daughters' food to keep them thin because thin girls were considered more valuable. They would prevent their children from playing outdoors to keep their skin pale because pale skin indicated wealth and leisure. Some families would even mutilate their daughters to increase their value. The Chinese practice of foot binding wasn't about beauty. It was about creating a product that would command a higher price in the marriage market. Bound feet indicated that a woman came from a wealthy family that could afford to have daughters who couldn't work. The economic pressure also led to the sexualization of very young children. If a girl's value was based on her potential as a wife and mother, then her sexuality became a commodity to be managed and sold. Parents would begin marketing their daughters' sexual potential while they were still in elementary school age. Marriage brokers, who were essentially human traffickers, would evaluate young girls like livestock, examining their physical development and predicting their future reproductive capacity. These evaluations were recorded in detailed reports that were shared among potential buyers. The language used in these reports is chilling. Children were described using terms we would now associate with the slave trade or livestock sales. They were evaluated for their breeding potential, their work capacity, and their trainability. But the business of child marriage also had profound effects on adult relationships and society as a whole. When marriage is primarily a business transaction, love becomes irrelevant or even dangerous. Emotional attachment between spouses could interfere with the economic functions of the marriage. A husband who loved his wife might be reluctant to use her labor for maximum profit. A wife who loved her husband might resist arrangements that benefited his family at her expense. Many cultures developed elaborate systems to prevent emotional attachment between spouses. Couples were kept apart, except for brief, supervised meetings. They were discouraged from spending time together or developing personal relationships. The goal was to maintain the marriage as a purely economic arrangement. This had devastating effects on human emotional development. Adults who had been raised as commodities often struggled to form genuine emotional connections. They had been trained from childhood to see relationships in terms of economic value rather than emotional fulfillment. The children of these marriages grew up in households where their parents were essentially business partners rather than loving spouses. This created generation after generation of people who understood marriage only as an economic institution, perpetuating the cycle. But the business model of child marriage also had broader social implications. It created rigid class systems where economic mobility was nearly impossible. If marriage was the primary way to change social status, and if marriages were arranged based on existing wealth, then poor families remained poor and rich families remained rich. The system also suppressed innovation and individual achievement. Why develop new skills or pursue education if your future was already determined by marriage contracts signed when you were a child? Many potentially brilliant minds were wasted because the marriage system provided no incentive for personal development beyond what would increase marriage value. Women, in particular, were denied any opportunity for intellectual or creative development. Since their value was based entirely on their role as wives and mothers, there was no reason to educate them or allow them to develop talents that wouldn't contribute to their marriage value. This represented an enormous waste of human potential. Half the population was essentially excluded from contributing to society in any meaningful way beyond their reproductive function. But as devastating as these systems were, they also contained the seeds of their own destruction. Because as economies became more complex and societies became more sophisticated, the rigid marriage system began to interfere with economic efficiency. Let's travel to the Renaissance period, where the first cracks in the child marriage business system began to appear. In 15th century Italy, something unprecedented was happening. Wealthy merchant families were beginning to educate their daughters, not because they valued women's intellectual development, but because educated wives were becoming more valuable in business negotiations. As trade became more international and complex, successful merchants needed wives who could speak multiple languages, understand accounting, and manage complex household finances. An illiterate wife who could only cook and clean was no longer sufficient for the new economy. This created an interesting paradox. The more valuable educated women became as business partners, the more expensive it became to replace them if they died in childbirth. Families began to see the economic wisdom of delaying marriage until women were older and stronger. But education had an unintended consequence. Educated women began to question the marriage system itself. They could read the contracts that governed their lives. They understood the economic calculations that determined their value, and some of them began to resist. The Renaissance period saw the first recorded cases of women refusing arranged marriages, even at the cost of being disowned by their families. These weren't acts of romantic rebellion. They were acts of economic revolution. Women were rejecting their status as commodities and demanding to be treated as individuals. The Protestant Reformation added fuel to this fire. Protestant theology emphasized individual conscience and personal relationship with God. This created a theological justification for personal choice in marriage that had never existed before. Martin Luther himself argued that marriage should be based on mutual consent rather than parental arrangement. This was a radical idea that struck at the heart of the child marriage business system. If individuals had the right to choose their spouses, then parents lost the right to sell their children in marriage. But the most powerful force challenging the child marriage system was the emergence of capitalism itself. As economies became more market-based and less feudal, individual merit began to matter more than family connections. In a feudal system, success was determined by who you were related to and who you married. In a capitalist system, success was determined by your ability to produce value in the marketplace. This shift gradually made arranged marriage less economically necessary. Successful merchants and entrepreneurs could build wealth without relying on marriage alliances. They could hire employees based on skill rather than family connections. They could expand their businesses through contracts and investments rather than marriage negotiations. This economic shift didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen everywhere at the same time. But wherever capitalism took root, the stranglehold of arranged child marriage began to loosen. The first major crack in the system appeared in the Netherlands in the 16th century. Dutch merchants, who were pioneers of modern capitalism, began allowing their children more choice in marriage partners. They discovered that happy marriages were actually more economically productive than miserable arranged marriages. A husband and wife who genuinely cared for each other worked together more effectively. They communicated better, made better joint decisions, and were more motivated to build a successful household economy. The Dutch began to see love not as a threat to marriage, but as a business advantage. This revelation spread slowly throughout Protestant Europe. The English, Germans, and Scandinavians began to experiment with giving young people more input into their marriage choices. The results were economically positive enough that the practice gradually became accepted. But the transition wasn't smooth or universal. Many families lost fortunes when their carefully planned marriage alliances fell apart because their children refused to cooperate. Traditional aristocratic families, whose wealth was built entirely on marriage connections, found themselves unable to compete with merchants and entrepreneurs who built wealth through business rather than breeding. The conflict between the old marriage system and the new economy created massive social upheaval. Wars were fought, families were destroyed, and entire social classes disappeared as the economic basis of society shifted. But nowhere was this conflict more dramatic than in the American colonies, where European settlers were creating entirely new societies from scratch. The American colonial period represents a fascinating laboratory for understanding how child marriage as business adapted to new economic conditions. European colonists brought their marriage traditions with them, but the conditions in the New World forced rapid adaptation. In early colonial Virginia, the gender imbalance created a unique marriage market. There were far more men than women, which should have increased the value of young brides. But the harsh conditions of colonial life required wives who were strong, capable, and mature enough to handle enormous responsibilities. A 13-year-old bride might be valuable in European society, where she would be supported by an extended household staff. But in colonial America, where families were isolated and resources were scarce, a child bride was more likely to be a liability than an asset. Colonial families quickly discovered that marriages worked better when both partners were old enough to contribute meaningfully to the family's survival. This led to a gradual increase in marriage ages throughout the colonial period. The Puritan communities of New England went even further. Their religious beliefs emphasized the importance of spiritual compatibility between spouses. This required that both partners be old enough to understand their faith and make informed spiritual decisions. Puritan marriage practices still involved significant parental input and economic considerations, but they also required the genuine consent of both partners, which was revolutionary for its time. A Puritan woman could refuse a marriage proposal if she felt it was spiritually unsuitable, even if it was economically advantageous for her family. This created the first systematic challenge to parental authority over children's marriages in Western culture. Puritan communities developed elaborate procedures for handling marriage disputes, including church councils that could overrule parents who tried to force unsuitable marriages. But the most significant change came from the economic opportunities available in the New World. Unlike Europe, where land was scarce and controlled by established families, America offered the possibility of creating wealth through individual effort rather than inheritance. A young man could claim land, clear it, and build a farm without needing to marry into a wealthy family. A young woman could contribute to a household's success through her labor and skills, not just through her family connections. This economic independence gradually undermined the necessity of arranged marriage. When individuals could create their own wealth, they didn't need to marry for economic reasons. They could afford to marry for love. The American Revolution accelerated this trend by explicitly rejecting traditional hierarchical authority. The same principles that justified rebellion against the British Crown also justified children's rebellion against parental control over marriage. Thomas Jefferson wrote about the pursuit of happiness as an inalienable right. While he didn't specifically mention marriage, many Americans interpreted this as including the right to choose one's own spouse. The Revolution created a cultural context where individual choice was valued over traditional authority. But the transition to love-based marriage wasn't complete or universal. Even in 19th century America, wealthy families continued to arrange marriages for economic and social reasons. The practice was particularly persistent in the American South, where plantation families maintained aristocratic European marriage traditions. Southern plantation marriages were essentially business mergers designed to consolidate landholdings and maintain social control over enslaved populations. These marriages were often arranged when the partners were very young, sometimes as early as age 10 or 12. The children of plantation owners grew up knowing that their marriages would be determined by their parents' need to maintain and expand the family's economic empire. Love was considered irrelevant or even dangerous because emotional attachment might interfere with the practical requirements of plantation management. But the Civil War destroyed the economic foundation of the plantation system, and with it, the last major stronghold of arranged child marriage in American mainstream culture. The Industrial Revolution completed the transformation. As the economy shifted from agriculture to manufacturing, individual skills and education became more important than family connections. Young people could earn their own money and make their own choices about marriage. By 1900, love-based marriage had become the norm in most of America and Western Europe. But this revolution in marriage practices had unintended consequences that we're still dealing with today. When marriage stopped being primarily a business transaction, it created new problems and challenges. Divorce rates increased because couples who married for love sometimes fell out of love. Economic instability increased because marriages were no longer designed to provide financial security. The shift also created new forms of inequality. In the old system, everyone's marriage was arranged by their parents according to economic logic. In the new system, attractive, charismatic, and socially skilled individuals had enormous advantages in the marriage market, while others were left behind. But perhaps most importantly, the end of arranged child marriage created a generational divide that persists today. Adults who had grown up in the old system often couldn't understand their children's insistence on marrying for love. Young people couldn't understand their parents' focus on practical considerations over emotional compatibility. This divide created family conflicts that sometimes lasted for generations. Parents who had sacrificed their own happiness for economic security couldn't accept their children's willingness to sacrifice economic security for happiness. But while Western societies were moving away from child marriage as business, the practice was actually intensifying in other parts of the world. The European colonial period created new pressures that made child marriage more attractive to families struggling to survive under foreign rule. Colonial administrators often preferred to deal with traditional family structures rather than individuals, which reinforced the importance of marriage alliances. In colonial India, British administrators found it easier to collect taxes and maintain order by working through traditional family and caste networks. This created incentives for Indian families to maintain traditional marriage practices, including child marriage, even when economic conditions might have otherwise led to change. The British also imposed new economic pressures that made child marriage seem like a survival strategy. Colonial taxation and land policies often left families impoverished and desperate to secure their children's futures through marriage alliances. Similar dynamics played out across the colonial world. In Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, European colonial rule often reinforced traditional marriage practices by making them seem like the only way to preserve cultural identity and economic security. But colonialism also introduced new complications to the child marriage system. Colonial laws sometimes conflicted with traditional marriage practices, creating legal ambiguities that could be exploited by unscrupulous individuals. Some colonial administrators tried to reform or eliminate child marriage, but usually without understanding the economic pressures that made the practice attractive to local families. These reform efforts often failed because they didn't address the underlying economic problems that made child marriage seem necessary. The result was a complex mix of traditional and modern marriage practices that often made the situation worse for children. Families might arrange traditional marriages while also trying to comply with colonial legal requirements, creating confusion and opportunities for abuse. The colonial period also saw the emergence of new forms of marriage trafficking. Colonial transportation networks made it easier to move children across long distances for marriage purposes. Some families began specializing in breeding and selling children for marriage to distant communities. These trafficking networks operated across colonial boundaries, creating international markets for child brides. A girl might be born in rural India, sold to a family in Burma, and eventually married to a man in Malaysia, with each transaction generating profit for the middlemen involved. The complexity and international scope of these networks made them difficult for colonial authorities to regulate or control. Even administrators who wanted to protect children often lacked the resources and legal authority to intervene effectively. But the colonial period also planted the seeds of modern human rights movements that would eventually challenge child marriage on a global scale. Christian missionaries, despite their often problematic attitudes toward local cultures, were among the first to systematically document and oppose child marriage practices. Their reports back to Europe and America helped create international awareness of the issue. Some missionaries established schools and orphanages specifically designed to provide alternatives to child marriage for vulnerable girls. While these institutions often had their own problems, they demonstrated that alternatives to child marriage were possible. The missionary movement also helped spread ideas about individual rights and personal dignity that were incompatible with treating children as commodities. These ideas gradually took root in colonized societies and provided intellectual foundations for later reform movements. By the early 20th century, a global movement against child marriage was beginning to emerge. International conferences and organizations began to address the issue as a human rights concern, rather than just a cultural practice. But progress was slow and uneven. 2 world wars disrupted reform efforts and created new pressures that actually increased child marriage in some regions. Economic instability and social upheaval made traditional marriage arrangements seem more attractive to families desperate for security. The post-war period saw renewed efforts to address child marriage through international law and development programs. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 included principles that were incompatible with child marriage, even though the practice wasn't explicitly mentioned. But perhaps the most powerful force for change was economic development itself. As countries industrialized and modernized, the same economic pressures that had ended child marriage in the West began to operate elsewhere. Education became more important than family connections for economic success. Women's participation in the workforce made their labor valuable outside of marriage. Government social programs reduced families' dependence on marriage alliances for security, but the transition has been far from complete. Today, child marriage continues to affect millions of children around the world, and the underlying economic pressures that drive the practice remain powerful in many communities. Let's examine how the business model of child marriage operates in the modern world. In contemporary societies where child marriage persists, the economic logic is often strikingly similar to what we've seen throughout history. Families facing poverty, conflict, or social instability use child marriage as a survival strategy. In rural Bangladesh, a poor family with several daughters might arrange marriages for their younger daughters to reduce the number of people they need to feed and house. The bride price or reduced dowry obligations provide immediate economic relief. In parts of Africa affected by drought or conflict, families might marry their daughters to men in more stable regions, viewing the marriage as a form of insurance that will protect their daughters from starvation or violence. In some Middle Eastern communities, child marriage is used to resolve disputes between families or to secure business partnerships. A marriage between children from different families creates obligations and connections that can be valuable for trade and social standing. Modern child marriage also involves increasingly sophisticated networks of brokers, recruiters, and facilitators who profit from arranging these transactions. Like their historical predecessors, these individuals treat children as commodities to be bought and sold for profit. Technology has actually made some aspects of modern child marriage worse than historical practices. Social media and mobile communications allow marriage brokers to operate across greater distances and to coordinate more complex transactions. Online platforms are sometimes used to advertise children for marriage, complete with photographs and detailed descriptions of their qualifications. These advertisements read remarkably like the historical marriage market documents we discussed earlier. The global economy has also created new pressures that drive child marriage. Economic inequality means that families in poor regions see marriage to men in wealthier areas as their daughter's only chance for a better life. Migration and urbanization have disrupted traditional family structures without providing adequate alternatives. Families that have lost their traditional economic roles may resort to child marriage as their only remaining source of income and status. Climate change is creating new drivers of child marriage as environmental pressures force families to make desperate choices about their children's futures. Droughts, floods, and other climate disasters often spike child marriage rates as families try to reduce their economic burdens. But modern child marriage also faces unprecedented opposition. International human rights organizations, women's rights movements, and child protection advocates have created a global network of resistance that didn't exist in earlier periods. Modern communications technology, while sometimes facilitating child marriage, also enables activists to document abuses, coordinate responses, and pressure governments to take action. Economic development programs increasingly recognize that child marriage is both a cause and consequence of poverty, leading to more comprehensive approaches that address the underlying economic pressures rather than just the symptoms. Education programs, particularly for girls, have proven to be one of the most effective ways to reduce child marriage rates. When girls have educational opportunities, families are more likely to delay marriage and invest in their daughters' development. Legal reforms have made child marriage explicitly illegal in most countries, even though enforcement remains problematic. The existence of these laws creates tools that activists and concerned individuals can use to intervene. But perhaps most importantly, economic changes are gradually reducing the incentives for child marriage in the same way they did historically in Western societies. As economies develop and social safety nets improve, families become less dependent on marriage alliances for survival. This process is slow and uneven, and millions of children continue to suffer while it unfolds. But the historical pattern suggests that economic development, combined with sustained advocacy and legal reform, can eventually eliminate child marriage as a widespread practice. However, a legacy of child marriage as business continues to shape modern society in ways we're only beginning to understand. The psychological and social effects of thousands of years of treating children as commodities don't disappear overnight. Many cultures continue to view marriage primarily in economic terms, even when they've moved away from explicit child marriage practices. The objectification of women and girls, the emphasis on family honor over individual rights, and the treatment of sexuality as a commodity all have roots in the historical business model of child marriage. Modern practices like dowry systems, bride price negotiations, and arranged marriages between adults often represent evolved forms of the same basic economic logic that drove child marriage historically. Even in societies that have completely rejected arranged marriage, the historical legacy influences contemporary attitudes about relationships, gender roles, and family structures. The business model of child marriage also established patterns of international inequality that persist today. Countries and regions that were historically sources of child brides often remain economically disadvantaged, while areas that imported brides often remain wealthier and more powerful. These historical patterns of exploitation created economic and social structures that continue to disadvantage the descendants of those who were treated as commodities in the marriage market. But understanding this history also provides tools for addressing contemporary problems. Recognizing that child marriage was fundamentally an economic system helps us understand why purely legal or cultural approaches to ending the practice are often insufficient. Effective strategies for ending child marriage must address the economic pressures that make the practice attractive to families. This means creating alternative sources of security and opportunity that make marriage alliances unnecessary. It also means recognizing that child marriage isn't an isolated cultural practice, but part of broader systems of inequality and exploitation that must be addressed comprehensively. The history of child marriage as business also reminds us that social practices that seem permanent and unchangeable can actually be transformed when economic and social conditions change. The same forces that ended child marriage in Western societies, economic development, education, legal reform, and changing cultural values, can work elsewhere when they're properly supported and sustained. But this transformation requires acknowledging the full scope and complexity of what we're trying to change. Child marriage isn't just a harmful cultural practice. It's the remnant of a global economic system that shaped human civilization for thousands of years. Changing this system requires the same kind of comprehensive economic and social transformation that occurred during the Industrial Revolution. It's not just about changing laws or attitudes. It's about changing the fundamental economic relationships that make child marriage seem attractive or necessary. This is a massive undertaking, but history shows us that it's possible. The same human creativity and adaptability that created the child marriage business system can be harnessed to create something better. The question isn't whether we can end child marriage, but whether we're willing to make the comprehensive changes necessary to address the underlying economic and social conditions that sustain it. As we conclude this journey through the dark history of child marriage as business, it's worth reflecting on how this story connects to our contemporary world. The transformation of marriage from a business transaction to a personal choice based on love represents one of the most significant social revolutions in human history. This change has fundamentally altered the nature of family life, gender relations, and individual freedom. But this revolution is far from complete. Today, approximately 12 million girls are married before their 18th birthday every year. That's 33,000 girls every single day who are forced into marriages they didn't choose, often for the same economic reasons that drove child marriage throughout history. In some regions, the situation is getting worse rather than better. Economic instability, climate change, and social conflict are creating new pressures that make child marriage seem like an attractive option to desperate families. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a stark reminder of how quickly progress can be reversed. Economic disruption caused by lockdowns and restrictions led to significant increases in child marriage rates in many countries, as families struggled to survive and saw marriage as their only option for protecting their daughters. This reversal demonstrates how fragile the progress against child marriage really is. Without addressing the underlying economic vulnerabilities that make families resort to child marriage, legal prohibitions and cultural campaigns can only achieve limited success. But there are also reasons for hope. Countries like Ethiopia, India, and Bangladesh have seen dramatic reductions in child marriage rates through comprehensive programs that combine legal reform, education initiatives, economic support for families, and community engagement. These successful programs share several common elements. They treat child marriage as an economic problem that requires economic solutions. They invest in girls' education and create pathways to economic independence. They work with communities to change attitudes rather than imposing external values. And they provide alternative sources of security and opportunity that make marriage alliances unnecessary. The key insight from these successful programs is that ending child marriage requires changing the economic calculation that makes it attractive to families. When girls have educational opportunities, when families have economic security, and when communities have social support systems, child marriage rates plummet. This economic approach also explains why simply raising the legal marriage age, while important, is insufficient by itself. If families are still facing the same economic pressures that made child marriage attractive, they may simply ignore the law or find ways around it. Effective change requires what economists call structural transformation, fundamental changes in how societies organize their economic and social systems. This is the same kind of transformation that occurred in Western societies during the Industrial Revolution, but it needs to be adapted to contemporary conditions and different cultural contexts. Technology offers some unique opportunities for this transformation. Mobile banking systems can provide economic security to families without requiring them to rely on marriage alliances. Online education can create opportunities for girls even in remote areas. Digital communications can connect isolated communities to broader support networks. But technology can also create new vulnerabilities. Social media platforms are sometimes used to facilitate child marriage by connecting brokers across different regions. Online marketplaces can make the commercialization of child marriage more efficient and harder to detect. The challenge is harnessing technology's positive potential while minimizing its negative impacts. This requires coordinated efforts between technology companies, governments, and daily life, and civil society organizations to create systems that protect children while promoting economic development. International cooperation is also crucial. Child marriage often involves cross-border networks, that exploit differences in laws and enforcement capabilities between countries. Addressing these networks requires the same kind of international coordination that we use to combat other forms of organized crime. But perhaps most importantly, ending child marriage requires acknowledging and addressing the historical legacy of treating children as commodities. This legacy continues to shape attitudes and practices in subtle ways that can undermine reform efforts. Many well-intentioned programs to end child marriage fail because they don't fully understand the economic logic that sustained the practice for thousands of years. They focus on changing cultural attitudes without addressing the material conditions that made those attitudes seem rational to families. Understanding child marriage as a business system helps us see why comprehensive economic and social change is necessary. It's not enough to convince families that child marriage is harmful. We need to create conditions where child marriage is no longer economically attractive or necessary. This historical perspective also helps us understand why change is possible. The same economic forces that created and sustained child marriage can be redirected to eliminate it. Human societies have demonstrated remarkable adaptability when economic conditions change. The transition from feudalism to capitalism eliminated child marriage in Western societies, not because people suddenly became more moral, but because the economic incentives changed. The same kind of transformation can occur elsewhere when the right conditions are created. But this transformation won't happen automatically. It requires sustained commitment from governments, international organizations, civil society groups, and individuals who understand the scope and complexity of what needs to change. It also requires recognizing that ending child marriage is connected to broader struggles for economic justice, gender equality, and human rights. Child marriage thrives in conditions of inequality and exploitation. Addressing it effectively requires addressing these broader systemic issues. The children who continue to suffer from child marriage today are the latest victims of a system that has persisted for thousands of years. But they may also be the last generation to experience it on a mass scale, if we're willing to make the comprehensive changes necessary to eliminate the economic conditions that sustain it. The story of child marriage as business is ultimately a story about human adaptability and the power of economic incentives to shape social behavior. For most of history, these incentives created systems that treated children as commodities. But the same forces can be harnessed to create systems that protect and nurture children instead. The choice is ours. We can continue to treat the symptoms of child marriage while ignoring the underlying disease. Or we can commit to the fundamental economic and social transformation necessary to eliminate it entirely. History shows us that such transformations are possible. The question is whether we have the wisdom and commitment to make them happen before another generation of children pays the price for our inaction. The business of child marriage has shaped human civilization for millennia. Now, it's time for human civilization to shape a world where childhood is protected, where marriage is based on choice and love, and where no child is ever again treated as a commodity to be bought and sold. The children of tomorrow are counting on us to get this right. Their futures depend on our willingness to learn from history and to build something better than what came before. In examining this dark chapter of human history, we discover not just the cruelty of past systems, but the possibility of creating more just and humane alternatives. The end of child marriage as business isn't just about protecting children. It's about creating societies that value human dignity over economic calculation, that prioritize love over profit, and that recognize children as individuals with rights and dreams, rather than assets to be leveraged. This transformation is happening, slowly and unevenly, across the world. Every girl who goes to school instead of getting married, every family that chooses education over economic alliance, every community that creates alternatives to traditional marriage arrangements, represents a victory over thousands of years of treating children as commodities. These individual victories are adding up to a global transformation that future historians may recognize as one of the most significant human rights achievements of our time. But that achievement is still incomplete, and its ultimate success depends on our willingness to understand and address the full complexity of what we're trying to change. The business of child marriage created enormous suffering, but it also demonstrated human creativity and adaptability. Now we need to channel that same creativity and adaptability toward building a world where every child can experience childhood, where every marriage is based on free choice, and where economic security doesn't require the sacrifice of human dignity. This is our challenge and our opportunity. The children of the world are waiting to see what we'll choose to build.